From the theme of Band of Brothers World War II series, United States Army Band, Pershing Zone. Let's hear it for them, ladies and gentlemen.
We will now hear a poem written by Oscar award-winning narrator, the late Mr. Peter Thomas, who took part in the D-Day invasion. Here to recite the poem is Friends of the National World War II Memorial Board member, retired Navy Rear Admiral John Bitoff.
When we went in, the beach had been taken. The living fought on, the dead forsaken. We were dropped into the water up to our shoulders. We waded in, a group of green soldiers, onto that thin strip of beach so many had tried to reach. They were the ones who went in first, among the machine gun fire and shell burst. They went to watery graves, sinking under the waves. The water was red, red from the dead, red from the dying, in agony crying. Those who made the land were not able to stand. They fell on the sand, writhing in pain, screaming for help in vain. Every advantage was on that hill. They murdered our men at will. The rain of death from the cliffs never stopped, but we just kept coming in from the sea, wave after wave, as far as you could see. Sheer courage and determination, not believing they were done, dictated victory that day. Others in the future will say, when they stand on that mighty height and look down at that thin strip of beach, they'll say, I don't see how they ever did it. They fought for every inch of it, up the sides of that fortified wall, over the cliffs so tall. I'll never forget that beach. I'll never forget the men in the ships, in the air and on the land, and those who died on the sand and in the water. They lie now beneath thousands of white crosses and stars of David above the beach. Those wonderful soldiers who died so young, they died so we could be free. How can we ever forget what they did? We honor them this day. We salute them, and we humbly beseech, dear God, bless the men who died on Omaha Beach.
Ladies and gentlemen, I now have the great, great honor of introducing you to some amazing American heroes who served their country with honor and dignity in World War II. Would each World War II veteran please stand or wave as I read your name? Mr. Herman Zeitchik. Stormed Utah Beach at H hour on D-Day with the Army's 4th Infantry Division, H hour on D-Day. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge, helped liberate Paris, and helped liberate Dachau. Mr. James Elsner Beirant. Served as a signalman first class with the US Navy and landed on Juno Beach on D-Day with a tank landing ship. He brought supplies to Omaha Beach on subsequent days. Mr. Dick Bailey. Served with the 322nd Bomber Group, 450th Bomb Squadron in the European Theatre of Operations. He flew 3 missions over Omaha Beach on D-Day. Mr. George Richard Peterson served as a staff sergeant with the U.S. Army Air Forces. Mr. Donald McKee was a member of the 29th Infantry Division and took part in the invasion of Normandy D+1. Mr. Ralph Waldrop served with the 320th Bomber Group, 440th Bomb Squadron in the European Theatre of Operations. Mr. Irvin Powell served with the 391st Bomber Group, 572nd Bomb Squadron in the European Theatre of Operations. Mr. Larry Thorpe served with the 397th Bomb Group, 598th Bomb Squadron in the European Theatre of Operations. Mr. Charles Lawrence Wheeler served as a captain in the U.S. Army Air Forces, where he was a test pilot. He served in the Pacific Theatre of Operations. Mr. Jose Baldonado served as a rifle marksman with the U.S. Marine Corps. A rifle marksman. He served in the Pacific Theatre of Operations, where he took part in Saipan, Okinawa, Okinoshima campaigns. Mr. David Wallman served as an air traffic controller at Thorpe Abbotts, England, with the 412th Air Service Group. He assisted with flight operations on D-Day. Mr. Stan Walsh served with the 397th Bomber Group, 598th Bomb Squadron in the European Theatre of Operations. Mr. Adelaido Ortega served with an air repair squadron as part of the U.S. Army Air Forces, where he worked on an airplane maintenance. Mr. Wilbur Williams served with the U.S. Navy on the USS Doran and the USS Jeffers. With the Jeffers, he participated in the invasions of Sicily, Normandy, southern France, and swept mines in the Pacific. Mr. Biliardo Blair served as a corporal with the U.S. Army in Germany. Mr. Francis Oakes enlisted into the U.S. Navy in 1944 at 17 years old. He was assigned to the USS Ticonderoga as a 20mm gunner as Coxswain Third Class. Today, Mr. Oakes is here honouring his good friend, D-Day veteran Mr. George Krakowski, who passed away this year at 99 years old. We are grateful that Mr. Krakowski's family is also with us here today. Mr. Bill Spurrier served with the 397th Bomber Group, 598th Bomb Squadron in the European Theatre of Operations. Mr. Eli Linden landed at Omaha Beach 3 weeks after D-Day, where he was injured. Later, he was captured and held as a German POW. Mr. Irv Cook served with the 397th Bomber Group, 599th Bomb Squadron in the European Theatre of Operations. Mr. John Rossman served with the US Army. He landed on Utah Beach on D-Day +5 and took part in the Battle of Northern France. Colonel Warren Halstead was a US Army Air Forces pilot with the 437th Troop Carrier Group and dropped 82nd Airborne Division paratroopers on D-Day. Mr. Lawrence Talamanti served as a Petty Officer Second Class in the US Navy. He was stationed in the Pacific Theatre of Operations, where he worked as a supply specialist. Mr. Dennis Firk served as a Staff Sergeant with the US Army's 23rd Infantry Division in the Pacific Theatre of Operations. Mr. Lou Peroni served as a ball turret gunner on the B-17 Flying Fortress. He flew 32 missions with the 533rd Bomb Squadron as part of the 8th Air Force. Judge William H. Webster served in the US Navy in the Pacific during World War II, and he again served in Korea. He later was a reservist, and at 95, he says he is still prepared to serve again if needed. Mr. Alfred Henry Bay served as a Staff Sergeant on Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, in an amphibious truck company, Dux. Mr. Philip Herrera served as a technician 5th grade with the US Army's 717th Tank Battalion in the European Theatre of Operations. Mr. Ellis Williamson served with the 397th Bomber Group, 599th Bomb Squadron in the European Theatre of Operations. Mr. John F. Nagel II served as an aviation radio man 2nd class with the US Navy. Mr. James Morgan Keel served as a seaman 1st class gunner on the SS John Chandler with the US Navy. He participated in the D-Day landings at Normandy 75 years ago today. Mr. Anthony H. Grant served in the Quartermaster Corps in Europe, arriving in Normandy a month after the D-Day landings. He also fought in the Korean War and retired as a major in 1962. Mr. Thomas Frederick Kissinger served as a pilot with the US Navy. Mr. Helmut Fred Bohm served with the 479th Motor Ambulance Company and was deployed to Normandy, France in July 1944, where he first saw action as the US Army fought through the hedgerows. Mr. Patsy Louis Del Vecchio served as a corporal with the US Marine Corps. Mr. Robert Levine served with the 90th Division and landed on Utah Beach as part of the Normandy invasion. He was later captured and held as a German POW. I will make a few very brief remarks. I am 53 years old. Thank you, gentlemen, from the bottom of my heart, for 75 years of freedom, democracy, and peace in Europe. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as we will now prepare for the official wreath laying at the Freedom Wall in honor of those who served and sacrificed during World War II. Today, particularly, we remember the more than 2 million Allied service members who took part in Operation Overlord and the more than 225,000 Allies who were killed, wounded, or missing.
Now presenting the wreath for the United States of America is the Maritime Administrator, Mr. Mark Busby, and Mr. Charles Sumner, Jr., Principal Deputy Assistant to the Secretary of Defense. Along with them will be Mr. Alex Kershaw, Mr. Herman Zychek, Mr. James Elsner Brennan, Mrs. Barbara George, daughter of Captain Malcolm George, who died on June 7, 1944, after landing with the invasion of D-Day. The next wreath is from Australia. It's presented by Wing Commander Matthew Stuckless, Assistant Air Attaché, Embassy of Australia. He is accompanied by World War II veterans, Mr. Dick Bailey and Mr. George Richard Peterson. Presenting the wreath for Belgium is Captain Gregory Delbert, Transportation Officer, Embassy of Belgium. He's accompanied by World War II veteran Mr. Donald McKee. Presenting the wreath for Canada is Mr. Christopher Gibbons, Political Minister, Counselor, and Captain Christian Monahan, Royal Canadian Navy, Embassy of Canada. They are accompanied by World War II veteran Mr. Irvin Powell. Accompanying the wreath for the Czech Republic is Brigadier General Jan Buras, Defense Military and Air Attaché, Embassy of Czech Republic. Accompanying him are World War II veterans, Mr. Larry Thorpe, Mr. Charles Lawrence Wheeler, and Mr. Jose Baldonado. Presenting the wreath for Denmark is Lieutenant Colonel William Kruger Clausen, Assistant Defense Military, Naval, and Air Attaché, Royal Danish Embassy. He's accompanied by World War II veterans Corporal David Woolman, Mr. Stan Walsh, and Mr. Adeladio Ortega. Representing the wreath for France, Air Force Colonel Oliver Kalajian, Deputy Defense Attaché, Embassy of France. He's accompanied by World War II veterans Mr. Wilbur Williams and Mr. Bilaldio Lee. Representing the country of Greece is Captain Charlamopoulos Pilididis, Naval Attaché, Embassy of Greece. He is accompanied by World War II veterans, Mr. Francis Ken Oakes and Mr. Bill Spurrier. Representing the country of Luxembourg is Ambassador Sylvie Lucas, Embassy of Luxembourg. Accompanying her is Mr. Eli Liddon, World War II veteran. We offer our condolences on the recent passing of the Grand Duke, Jean of Luxembourg, who was a decorated World War II veteran who landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 11, 1944. Representing the Netherlands is Colonel Paul Everding, Army Attaché, and Lieutenant Colonel Sef van de Ville, Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. They are accompanied by World War II veteran Mr. Jonathan Rossman. Representing the country of New Zealand is Commodore David Gibbs, Defense Attaché, Embassy of New Zealand. He is accompanied by World War II veterans Colonel Warren Halstead and Mr. Lawrence Telemati. Representing the country of Norway is Colonel Magni Roda, Military Attaché, Royal Norwegian Embassy. He's accompanied by Mr. Dennis Firk and Mr. Lou Perron. Representing the Republic of Poland is Judge William Webster, Mr. Alfred Henry Bay, and Mr. Felipe Hera. Representing the country of Slovakia, Chaplain Commander Gary Thornton, Jr., United States Navy, Mr. Ellis Williamson, Mr. John F. Nagel II, and Mr. James Morgan Keel, all World War II veterans. Representing the United Kingdom is Commodore Andrew Benton, Royal Navy, British Embassy, Mr. Anthony H. Grant, World War II veteran, Mr. Thomas Frederick Kissinger, World War II veteran, and Ms. Evelyn Berquist, student, Stock STEM Middle School, Magnet. Representing the National Park Service is Mr. Jeffrey Reinbold, Acting Superintendent, National Mall and Memorial Parks. Paige Padilla, student, Stock STEM Middle School, Magnet. World War II veterans, Mr. Helmut Fred Bohem, Miss Patsy Louise Del Becchio. And our last wreath is presented by Friends of the National World War II Memorial. Mr. Josh Bunning III, Chairman, Friends of the National World War II Memorial. Colonel Andrei Obernevich, Embassy of Ukraine. Mackenzie Zinn, student, Stock STEM Middle School, Magnet. And Mr. Robert Levine, World War II veteran, POW. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, please rise and render appropriate honors for the playing of taps. You may be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time we honor all branches of our armed forces with the playing of the Armed Forces Service songs. If you are serving or have served in one of the branches of service, please rise to be recognized when your service song is being played. And now, performed by the United States Army Band Pershing, the Armed Forces Medley. United States Merchant Marines. United States Coast Guard. United States Air Force. United States Navy. The United States Marine Corps.